Well, this is Shaw coming on the channel to talk about Chivalry, the book Chivalry by Peter Wright and Paul Elam. Chapter 1 in the intro is what we're going to cover today, and this is good stuff. Really liking this stuff. And if you get yourself a copy, I mean, on Kindle, I think it was like $2 for to copy this book. Really good stuff. Talking about, the state of how we got to where we are in a femme-centric world. Hey, and if you're liking this content, give me a like, subscribe, and give me a comment below. It's going to be a longer video. It's over an hour, but it's good stuff. You're going to want to stick around. Really like conversation, talking about these chapters, and then, talking about some other things too. So stay tuned. Good stuff. Let's talk about Chivalry, the book by Peter Wright. And do you know, did Paul Elam, did he... was it more Peter Wright that kind of wrote it, and Paul Elam just contributed some to it, or?
It's more Peter Wright. Most of the book is Peter Wright, and then there's a couple sections in there that were actually authored by Paul. So they're included in there, and so that has them as a co-author here on the cover.
Okay. And Peter Wright, he watches your show then too, right?
Yeah. We follow each other on Twitter, and sometimes we'll message and just kind of trade ideas, and sometimes he does a really great job of just sleuthing like really old sources, and he'll find like newspaper clippings of things. He sent me some really good ones on the dowry, which I'm gonna present on stream soon.
Oh, cool.
But it's amazing because they're from like the late 1800s, and it really puts you into the mind of France back then, or England. And so we talk every now and then. Every now and then he comes on the channel and blesses us with his presence, which I appreciate.
How old is he then?
I'm not exactly sure. I think maybe like a tad younger than Paul. So I'm guessing probably 50s or so.
50s or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like he's told me, and I feel bad for not remembering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in the introduction, I noticed, he starts off the book by defining, like, in a simple sentence, it seems like chivalry, or at least the modern day chivalry is the rules of male obligation. And I thought that's a pretty good way just to put it in a short little phrase.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I noticed that too. He also did that with gynocentrism in there, but
Yeah,
chivalry,
we'll get to that. Yeah.
chivalry is an interesting thing because I feel like it's a word people hear about a lot, but they don't, like, even me myself, I'm guilty of this. I didn't really know what it meant or what the origin of it was or where it came from. I thought it was just the whole open and doors thing, and that was sort of the end
Yeah,
of
it seems
that.
like when you hear it off the cuff, most people think, oh, it's a gentleman who is kind and shows respect to women.
Yeah.
But the roots of it are so bad, and like where it came from.
Hmm.
But I can get on board with that. Yeah, open a door, that's nice.
Yeah.
Uh, but then when you think a lot deeper about it, it's like, well, that does kind of flip society on its head when we give rules to men and their obligations, but then we really don't have any for women.
Yeah, I think one thing that really surprised me and is, I think what we have now would be more better termed romantic chivalry, because
Yes.
the origins of it, as Peter describes in the book, is actually from a kind of a military chivalry, or something that's more about a code for
Mm,
men when it comes to that kind of stuff, whether it's for knights and the
yeah.
duties that go along with being a good warrior. And
Hmm.
this introduces something called the feudal model, which is a knight swearing allegiance to a lord, one specific lord, and you can't do that with, let's say, multiple of them. And
Yeah.
there's a specific relationship there, and on the other side, the lord provides him with different lands and whatever it is he's responsible for and derives incomes from. But it's something that makes sense, and especially in that time period.
Yeah.
But then, what we see happen is there's this kind of co-opting, or even a kind of hijacking of these things, and it's kind of done by these proto-feminist noble ladies who find a
Mhm.
way to create a feudal model of romance where it's the man getting on one knee and putting her in a station above
Yeah.
him as a lady, and then he goes into, instead of a service to a lord, in the capacity of a knight, he's going into a kind of love service to one specific lady and performing
Well,
feats
yeah,
and
let's
things.
let's go back to that. So he in the second part of the introduction, he talks about how there's military chivalry, which is where it started, and then there's gynocentric chivalry, or basically romantic chivalry.
Hmm.
And so he starts to separate those. And so the military chivalry, like you were saying, is what chivalry really began as, of like a code between knights for fair play
Hmm.
than between each other. So you wouldn't, if you knocked a guy off his horse in battle or something, you wouldn't just go up and impale him with a sword, which I guess you kind of had the right to do because he's your enemy. But
Yeah.
there was this code of like, no, I'm going to give you a fair chance to remount on your horse, and we can continue in battle because we have like mutual respect for each other as soldiers or something like that. That would be like one example of
Yeah. Yeah, a kind
military
of
chivalry.
mutual honor there, and it sort of separates you kind of from the other classes there,
Mm.
and gives a kind of respect and nobility even to the kind of person who's engaged in that type of
Yeah, I
code.
think even there was an element of some of the knights way back were almost criminals. And so there was another part of the code that was like, you don't mistreat people, you don't just like go and ransack their land and take all their
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
because you're a big strong knight. But it's like the lords kind of had this, the lords and knights kind of had this code, like, okay, we're going to treat people fairly when we go and invade. We're not just going to completely ransack them.
It
And
it almost kind of reminds me, as just as a guy's watched films and stuff, but the Magnificent Seven,
mm,
um, where you have a sort of village there with kind of the normal people, and they're being attacked by basically some, I don't know,
bandits.
some bandits, and they're strong warriors or whatever, but they're taking advantage of it and just stealing food from these people and ruining their lives. And then this small group of, you can almost call them chivalrous cowboys or whatever, coming and just
Yeah,
have this code of honor that they live by. Uh,
yeah,
God, that's such
yeah.
a
That
good
is a
movie.
pretty good analogy, I think, of what was part of that chivalric code.
Yeah, and
That
it wasn't about, women in particular. It was about these other different classes and stuff that lived on those lands and how they conducted themselves with them, people who weren't in the warrior class.
yeah,
And it gave a sense of honor there. So there was a very well defined, I guess, code of conduct, you can say. And then as it starts to be co-opted by romantic chivalry, you start to see this
yeah.
kind of borrowing of that code to then sort of, I guess, try to refine these folks further, or at least make them more accommodating of that feminine spirit, or the more feminist spirit, you can say, back
Well, and
then.
I think he talks about that where he says in the first part of chapter one that um, the thing that was used was shaming. That
Hmm.
you would shame knights who were bad, who were behaving badly, you would shame them so that they wouldn't behave in that way. But then when we got into then the romantic chivalry, which is it kind of got, um, you know, co-opted into, then that shaming took on a different view, which he goes into, where you had, now he was saying you had like uh some of,
I do know which part you're talking about there, where he talks about shame, and one of the main things is that they'll look for the worst and the most unruly of men, and then pretty much put that on the entire gender, which you kind of see
yeah,
today, where it's like,
yes,
maybe even you see that more recently in the dating world, where some guys, maybe a small minority, are doing something, and they will take those behaviors and say it's all men and men need to be doing this or that. But back
Yeah.
then, it's funny, he described in a paragraph these kind of unruly guys, and I'd hate to admit that it all sounded kind of fun to me. But, you know, riding in on horses into mess halls and just rude young men with diverting eyes and salters in the very midst of mass.
Mm,
Tournaments and occasional brawls. The cracked skulls and gouged eyes didn't sound too fun. But the dice flying sounded great and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
the sort of noble ladies with power, some of them saw that, and they start offering these kind of classes, or uh commissioning books to be written to say this is how you should be a gentleman, and
Yeah, he
especially
mentions
around
like one of the
ladies.
first was that French countess named Marie. Was
Marie
it?
de France, I think. Is that it?
Yeah, yeah. That she was one of the
Oh,
first
Countess Marie. Yeah.
to reform the unruly gender. Uh, and then, like just like you're saying, he points out this first started to happen. It was to convince men of their shared flaws, shaming them. And then it's going to quickly grow into, I think, because of Countess Marie, is what a lot of it traces back to, is romantic love was the remedy for these unruly males who like to fight and do these kinds of things.
Yeah. What's interesting about that too is I guess that's supposed to be, the payoff for the guys, so to speak, is you reach this loftier, more subtle, and all these different levels of love that come
Mm,
with serving a lady in that way. But what's interesting
mm,
is, as he describes it too, especially, is that this sort of creates extramarital type of engagements at first, and there was two
yeah.
kinds. There was people who would basically serve and I guess never get anything, and then there was people who were looking for, going all the way or whatever. But
Well,
it's
he didn't in chapter one, he didn't get into that a lot, I don't
yeah.
think. But I know just from a lot of my other reading on
Mhm.
chivalry, it is like courtly love, like this romantic chivalry
Yeah.
is all based on adultery.
Yeah.
Like it's nothing but adultery because it's you know queens and noble women, I guess
Yeah.
they're all married. They're all like
Yeah.
you talk
Like
dowry,
arranged
arranged
marriage,
marriage,
dowries, exactly.
all yes, exactly. And so, but these knights who are single men come and they have adulterous affairs with them,
Yeah.
and that's the whole game that they play.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so yeah, he didn't talk about it a lot in chapter 1. The only part I think I saw it in there is where he discusses the different types of troubadours. And
Okay.
it's interesting because it does, some of the troubadours that are more on the adultery side do kind of are reminiscent of our more recent pickup artist type guys, and they
Yeah,
really
he
know
said that.
how to play into this, and are kind of, I guess, teaching others how to do this and that kind of
Mm,
thing. Um, but it's strange because that is what's going on. I guess you wouldn't expect it, but it makes sense because he even mentions that romantic love was considered as this kind of mental instability back then. It's almost seen as like a kind of
yeah.
sickness, or something is like wrong with this
Yeah.
person. And it's interesting too because I think in other parts of the world, or at least in earlier times, it was always like that. Like, I don't know, getting hit with Cupid's arrow or something, or you
Yeah,
know
like we talked about a few weeks ago there. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then as time goes on, after hundreds of years, it starts to disseminate through the classes. So that, I think the important thing to realize is that it starts, I think almost 800 years ago in the 12th century, but it was
Mhm.
limited to a very small elite group of people with, courtly love and these kinds of things. Most other
Yeah,
folks.
it was like the bored aristocracy, these bored women who just like needed something to entertain themselves with. So they
Mhm.
came up with romantic chivalry
Yeah.
to come up with this code where these knights could perform for them and prove their love for them. Usually, by if you look at some of the stories that were come up, it was usually by humiliation that they would prove their love for their woman, or they would go and fight in jousting competitions and things like
Hmm.
that in order to prove their love and get the or win the approval of a woman. And he makes that comparison into our modern day of how many of our sports things seem to be done to win the affection of a woman, or even going off to war now a lot of
Yeah.
times is see, like he mentions that scene, like we put the picture of your woman in the airplane that you're flying, over in World War II, and oh, I'm doing this for her, or what, that kind of stuff. It's like very romanticized. I get to die for the woman at home, blah blah blah.
Yeah, it's I guess I never thought about it too much, but as I was reading that part in this book, because he talks a lot about how this translates into like Hollywood movies of, bombs going off around this couple or the guy having the
Mhm.
picture in his uniform pocket. And I remember seeing
Yeah,
movies like that growing up, like some Jean-Claude Van Damme films and just
yeah,
different things like that I remember. And it's amazing how much of this stuff has taken over the culture and how you grow up in this kind of, I don't want to call it a gaslighting, but in this sort of bubble of romantic chivalry. And I
mm,
think it takes a lot for folks to kind of want to tear out of that bubble, or unless usually it's like something bad happens. That's when guys end up on the red pill side because they were kind of following this blueprint, and then
yeah,
something very unexpected happened that they didn't expect to happen.
yeah, yeah, and I agree. And even, I mean, even for myself, like I have a great family. I've got a great marriage. I've got a great wife.
Mhm.
But I just recognize how it's just crept into the church and affected our spiritual life, where we can't even see what scripture says, what it plainly says. We just, like, it's almost like we've been brainwashed because of some of this stuff of like, oh, no, no, no. We serve women. That's what we're here to do. It's like,
Yeah,
no,
I mean,
no, it's not.
right in the first paragraph, that's in the intro actually, not the first chapter, but he talks about the sort of protect and provide. He says the
Mm,
importance of chivalry is taught to little girls and boys from the start, outlining for them the various rules of male obligation that will guide sexual relations throughout their lifetimes, i.e., males are here to protect and provide for women. And on the
yeah.
surface, that doesn't sound bad, protect and provide. But more
Hmm.
recently, I've started to come to the opinion or accept that protect and provide is very much a sort of romantic chivalric gaslighting, so to speak. And
Mm,
especially when
okay.
it comes to maybe women that aren't in your family or that you're not married to or not your direct kin. Like it sounds weird to say.
Yeah.
Like, and I can even give the protection part. Like I think, okay, maybe there's a case to be made for that. But the provide part also seems
Mm,
to, as I learn more about dowries and things like that, there just seems to be this kind of dumping onto to just the men certain responsibilities that were initially duties of like both sides of this equation, whether it was her and her
yeah.
family, and then, but instead it's like just you, the guy, you need to demonstrate your love by doing all these tasks, and that could include providing every single thing or making
No, I
sure
I
she's
think,
absolutely to want for nothing, so it takes away
yeah,
too
and,
much
and
duty from
really,
them.
Shaw, I commend you. You're doing some really great work in that dowry area of like, hey, this really isn't traditional
Yeah.
what we think of a traditional marriage and a traditional man. That, I mean, you're doing great work. You're opening my eyes to this stuff. Like, wow, yeah, that, I mean, if we look at history, yeah, a woman, even like we were talking before, it just seems like a better family system as well, of like you receive an inheritance early, you can establish a household, and it's a check on hypergamy. I mean, it's just like, yeah, I think you're doing really valuable work in that area that I don't hear anybody else talking about, that kind of thing.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm really excited to share some of the newspaper clippings because it's so like the dowry structure is going right up all the way in through the 1800s, even further than that in
Mm,
some places. And like even when you look at chivalry, Peter talks about it being available to a small minority at first. And it's
yeah.
like the sort of love match that we have now, this sort of romantic model, this romantic feudal model, you can say, is
Mm.
really something that requires, I guess, a heavy amount of financing or being able to pay for, because it's almost something that you shouldn't be doing, and it's like a pure indulgence from the beginning. It's like the sweetest sugar or something like that, and it's
Oh.
just not, in my opinion, the organic way to do things. So it's like when you see chivalry and romantic chivalry
Mm.
coming, it's only happening with this aristocratic class for a long time. And then you
Mm.
start to see, you know, there's already books and stuff of these things happening, but then when the printing press comes in, it starts to become more accessible, more people become literate.
Yeah.
And then there starts to become more class awareness of it. But looking at these articles and these newspaper things from even just a couple hundred years ago, you do see that even though most of the people were kind of, the culture of the romantic love was starting to take over, most normal folks could not really afford to indulge in that so much, and it was still
Mm.
limited until even more recently, once you get modernization and all these kinds of things. So I'm having a blast looking at this stuff because I'm trying to like really see, when did this handoff happen, or what was the process like that got us to where we are today. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because it really
You mean
does go.
I think I understand what you're saying. Like, where did the dowry propositional marriage, and where did chivalric or romantic marriage kind of take over? Is that what?
Yeah, you could pretty much put it that way, from like marriages of duty and duty to your respective families and doing
Yeah.
stuff that helped everybody, not just about you guys having this sort of love story that you'd read in the tale of romantic chivalry or some knight doing some courageous thing, or even more recently, a romance novel that, a lot of women tend to read nowadays.
Yeah.
Um,
50 Shades of Grey.
yeah, and it seems to happen, as you get this sort of democratization of the love match, as
Mm.
I always kind of relate it to economy. It's culture too, but both of those are kind of intertwined, and as people can
Okay.
start affording it, but even going back to 1850s, I read a great paper on my stream from 19th century Germany, which is in the 1800s, and it's looking at data for who is getting married. And most people would kind of maybe say some words about love here or there, but when it came down to the marriage negotiations, the assets that both parties were bringing into the marriage was like paramount. That was the most important thing, or the marriage
Yeah, I
wouldn't
watched
happen.
that stream. Yeah, that was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's, I think that's one thing that's just important for folks to note there, is that this was only something that a very small elite minority of people can indulge in. It started off as kind of extramarital affairs,
Yeah.
basically. And then our culture kind of processes this as best as it can to try to create a system that says, okay, you guys can do this, but let's try to do it within marriage. And then, so I think in that way, marriage then starts to evolve also to say, well, because if people are doing this, how can we make this match with the culture? So there's like a tug of war there that's going on, I would
Mm.
imagine, between, these nobles, the other people, maybe the church itself, the
Mm.
state. And it's
Yeah.
somebody left a comment in my Discord. His name's Klaus, and he was, after he watched that stream, he was talking about how it seems like a lot of our more recent marriage laws were kind of created to accommodate romantic love, where before they didn't need laws in that way because marriage was different. I was like, oh, that's a very interesting insight. Like I
Mm.
think that does make sense. And then once you get to no fault divorce, it kind of takes the bottom out of this, where it's like a love match is very hard to do because there's no protection for, the hero who's coming in to provide everything and do everything
Oh,
he can.
yeah.
So
Yeah. It does seem like the system is collapsing on itself. Which, yeah, I think that needs to happen quickly. Uh,
yeah, you're not the only one I've heard that from. It seems like a lot of folks, I think that that's something we're looking at. So
I just mean this is like the marriage system that we have is just completely nuts. So
yeah,
that it like 2024 is the lowest number of marriages on record in the United States, right? So it looks like the collapse is already happening. Like
yeah.
people aren't getting married, and I don't see why there's a good reason to get legally married either. Like what
It
what is the point?
yeah, it is, and it seems like more men are waking up to that, and it's something when you hear, and you're not the only married guy that's told me this. I've had other married guys say, "Hey, I do have a good marriage, thank God, but
Yeah.
I feel the same way you guys do, or you're right, or they've seen so many of their own friends and colleagues and family members go through bad divorces, so they're in this small minority."
Yeah.
And it's just like, man, when married guys are telling you that too, it's just like something's going on. I think that's why I've tried my best to kind of look into these other types of arrangements when it comes to dowry and things, because it's like, well, how are folks going to weather this sort of storm? Um,
Mm.
what what's your opinion on sort of where chivalry is today? Because I hear, and it's in the intro. I think it's in the intro, or maybe it was chapter one, but folks will say, he says that you often hear this phrase, chivalry is dead. But then it's like when you look
Yeah.
at the kind of dating expectations, it seems to be pretty much filled with chivalric things that
Yeah, I don't.
men generally do.
Well, chivalry might be dead for a man that's just not interested in dealing with women at all. But if you want to be successful in, dating and marriage, then you're going to be interested in chivalry. I mean, I don't understand how else it would go other than that. But yeah, I don't think it's dead at all. Like you're saying, and really, even this is some of the stuff I've read with like Dal Rock and whatnot, is that um, feminism is the parasite which feeds on the back of chivalry. So without chivalry, we wouldn't have feminism
Yeah.
either. Because,
That was a kind of important point that he brought in here, is um this romantic chivalry kind of leads to this feudal model, which is essentially
mm,
gynocentric, and it just
yeah,
gives them more
yeah,
and more power to define what, I guess, love service looks like and these kinds of things. And it sort of leads to this handoff, or you can just say it just becomes feminism in the more modern
mm,
era, where men are kind of castigated for being men,
yeah.
and told that they need to do this or that, and
Well,
the
he says like the feudalism, like the men are the vassals and the
Mhm.
women are seen as the maidens or the lords.
Yeah,
And so the men are here to serve the women in any way they can, die for them, whatever. And the women are here to be served. Like it's the vassal and the lord
yeah,
model
yeah.
that,
It's funny. It's even tough for me. Like sometimes in the sense of like my everyday life or something, because you're brought up a certain way, and
mm,
it's I guess once you notice it, then it's hard to unsee. But there's always, like, ladies first, or they get on the light, whatever it is, like
yeah,
that you can think of. There's a lot of those kind of, I guess, maxims that you grow up with, and all that
yeah,
kind of thing. And the weird thing, especially when it comes to things like red pill and this kind of stuff, is the guys kind of seem to have figured out, at least from intersexual dynamics and whatever it happens to be, that by sort of not playing into that role so much, they actually end up doing better with women in terms of attraction and these kinds of things. So we live in
yeah.
this, there's a lot of this sort of confusion there. And then what I
Mm,
see from trad cons and stuff like that is you know they would get to a point where they're trying to maybe accept some of that stuff, but they also don't want to give up this protect and provide model, or not even really question it so much, or they'll say this is how it's always been. Um,
mhm.
and it seems to just be another way for them to kind of sneak guys back onto the sort of same thing they've been doing the whole time, which unfortunately isn't working for a lot of guys.
Yeah, and yeah, I think they're in a losing battle. Then at least that's what the data seems to show, and it's always just, well, man up and do better, blah blah. I don't think that's effective anymore. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I also liked in this chapter too was that he kind of set out some of these archetypes that do really like he gave us these kind of
yeah,
actors in this sort of theater drama of romantic chivalry, and you know
yeah.
he equates the courtly ladies to feminists.
To the feminists, yeah.
Yeah, and you know he talks about even in the 12th and 4th centuries, evidence shows that women began to agitate for increased authority over the quote unquote correct way for men and women to
Mhm.
conduct relationships, with particular emphasis on what they felt were acceptable roles for males in a dignified and civil society. And you know
Yeah.
nowadays, it's not uncommon to hear how men are supposed to conduct themselves or criticisms from feminists especially, and them kind of taking
Mm.
this huge victim role. And
Well, I think the thing that may be changing, Shaw, is that especially the younger men, they don't care what the women. Whereas like older men, the baby boomers, those kind of that generation, they really did. Like if they would get shamed by women, they just but it seems like I could be wrong, but it seems like the younger generation just doesn't care if the
yeah, you know, it's interesting too because it's funny when I think about the generational divide, like there's when you think about maybe folks from that boomer era, most of them, even if they go through a bad divorce, will still get remarried or marry even a
yeah,
third time, even if they're really bad divorces, because it's just so ingrained in them back then. And as
yeah.
the generations have gone by, you've seen guys start to shed this conditioning a bit. Um,
Mhm.
and you know, one of the other things, the other character in here was what he called the White Knights, which you know, Red
Yeah,
Pillars do know that term, but there starts to be these knights who pretty much uphold this, and they will challenge anybody who you know offends milady or anything like that. And I
hmm,
mean, when you look at young guys, I sometimes wonder, it's like how many men are still like that versus like how many are waking up to it. And it seems like there's been this kind of you know reaching a critical mass of guys that are either walking away or saying no thanks. But you know sometimes I hear other folks' opinions and they say I don't know, there's way just too many simps quote unquote out
yeah,
there that
yeah.
men haven't understood it all the way yet. And I like to take the more positive opinion on that and say no, you know I'd like to think men are starting to get it a little bit, but sometimes it's tough to know.
I want it. This sounds kind of bad, but I wonder too if it's because the women are so masculine and butch and just ugly that the men aren't willing to simp for them anymore,
Yeah,
or it's less of it. Because right, I think if a woman is hot enough, then the guys are gonna simp for her.
yeah.
If she's a 10, they're gonna like. But if all the women that you're around are just like then yeah, maybe you're just like, I don't need to appeal to them or try to white knight them.
Yeah, I'm you know when I think of it seems like a lot of guys, I mean, I can speak for myself. When I was younger, I'd say I was doing the same thing, and it generally takes a few different experiences until you kind of snap out of that. You know, some guys will
Mm,
meet maybe somebody that it works with or that they just have a good relationship with, but a lot of guys I think hit this point where it's just constant failure or some kind of traumatic relationship traumatic type incident happens to where they start
okay.
to snap out of it. Um, I'd like to think, you know, as other factors do change, like, you know, economically speaking, like in maybe boomer time or something like that, you know, it's one guy can get a job and get an apartment or even a house,
Mm,
maybe with a little bit more ease than as the time went on. But nowadays it's a lot harder than that. So as it
yeah.
becomes tougher for one guy to play this hero role and meet all these, I guess, quote unquote, quasi pseudo traditional, you know, expectations of paying for everything, and they just can't do it. And then the women
Yeah.
are the women are just as much affected by this as the men. So the women feel like they're entitled to certain things, or that a man's job is to do these kinds of things. So they're not willing
Well,
to.
and I think you're the first one I've heard Shaw bring up that, like, yeah, men have to compete for the same jobs that the women are going for, and in many cases, the women are giving preferential treatment to get those same jobs.
Yeah, that's actually so. I the It's Complicated channel. That's where I first heard him pose that question to somebody, and
Oh,
I just thought it was so good. I was like, it makes complete sense. How he asks it in this way, where it's how are men expected to be providers if they're competing in the same job market as women, taking half the jobs basically. So
yeah.
it's putting wages down, and then if they're already working and then still wanting to get with the guy that makes more, it's a recipe for disaster.
Well, and I know, like, personally, I know I work for a large company, and I know they will hire if they have an equivalent man and woman, they
Hmm.
will hire the woman. I
Wow.
know that.
Yeah, to meet a
And
quota or something like that.
yeah, I mean, it's in our metrics for things we have to make progress on that we publish to shareholders,
Oh,
that
wow. Okay.
we have to hire more. Well, like, we have to make progress on certain minorities and women.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like they are going to, if they publish that to shareholders, that means they will make progress on it. Like, they can't come out the next year and be like, oh, yeah, we're 3% down. But, like, they're going to make progress on that
Yeah.
if they start measuring it.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I guess it makes sense why all these companies do that. So there must be some kind of funding or investors or somebody who comes in and sees those metrics and says, "Okay, that fits. Let's put more money here." It
Yeah, I mean, it actually, that's a good point. It may be pushed by these huge, like, BlackRock and those
Mhm.
types of, huge hedge fund firms and whatever, or even pension funds that say, like, we will divest in your company if you don't meet certain,
Yeah. That is
hiring
quite
standards,
strange.
whatever.
Yeah, because when I think of like a regular shareholder, if it's just like you or me buying some stocks or something, like most people probably wouldn't even look at it that deeply or even look at half those
Yeah.
reports. But it's not just random guys, women buying this. It's these big sort of
Oh, yeah. I mean,
folks
some of
that
they're so
big
huge
money
they could,
comes in.
yeah. I mean, they could bankrupt your stock if they divested.
Oh wow,
Just Oh yeah, something they're just huge. The amount of capital they I mean, there's conspiracy videos about how BlackRock basically controls the world because of how much market share they have in all these companies, stuff like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. I,
Uh,
I I think I've seen some of those. So I mean, they'd carry weight wherever they put in their
yeah.
money. But yeah, that's it's going back to the provider thing. This is why I've kind of spent so much time trying to look at this. Where is this coming from? And it seems like the current expectation we have as men being providers isn't historically accurate in the sense that we understand it, and it's more brought upon by romance, and especially romantic chivalry becoming this romantic love model that we have. There was actually
Mhm.
a newspaper clipping Peter shared with me, and it's about it's kind of castigating men and shaming men. This is more recently, like in the late 1800s, or I'll have to read that on stream. But it's about saying, like if a man really loves her, then he won't care if she comes with the dowry or not. So we're starting to
Mhm.
see this changeover, and even the French are kind of
Oh,
looking at the English like, "Oh, that's kind of weird," because they were giving dowries more so even after the English kind of started moving away from them. So you have French people looking at this and thinking, "Oh, that's very strange how the English are doing it." And
really?
yeah, yeah, there are some great articles about this. I'll have to do a stream where I just go through all of these different newspaper clippings. There's even one where it's a guy who visits England, and he's a Chinese guy, and he's comparing
Mm.
and contrasting. I think it was written in like 1912 or something. It was around there, but he's comparing and contrasting how marriage is done in China with
Mm.
how marriage is done and what he witnessed in England. And he found it to be completely irrational how the matches are made, because by that time they're all being made by romantic love and that kind of thing.
Even in China, they are?
No. It's a Chinese guy talking about what he's seeing in England. And
Oh, sorry. Okay.
yeah. So
All
he's
right.
talking about the English model,
Mm.
and then how it contrasts with what they do in China. And he's just like, oh, this is. I guess I can see why they would do that, but to him it just seems very selfish, just for the two people, and
Okay.
not really
Yeah.
duty bound or duty driven. And he talks about how love in the Chinese marriage system starts to sprout after the marriage, way
Mm.
after the marriage, and there's a kind of respect and this that develops, but not before. And it reminds me, there's also
Oh.
another newspaper clipping where there's a French guy, and it's funny because the French gave us the city of love, Paris. But
Yeah.
there's a quote from a. Oh no, that was in the last stream that I did on that paper about pairing up in 19th century Germany. But there's a French quote talking about how if people marry for love, they better plan on hating each other, not so
Oh, I
long after the
remember
marriage.
you reading that. Yeah.
Yeah, so so you can kind of see how this develops, as that becomes a thing, and then suddenly it goes from only annulments to okay, we're gonna do at fault. So if it gets so once you guys hate each other, once if it gets really bad, then here are the ways you guys get divorced, all the way up into no fault, which is just like, well, as soon as one person's out of love, then you can just
Yeah.
unilaterally leave.
Yeah. And that's why I think people are just getting, the lowest number of marriages because it's like, well, what's the point of involving legal papers and all that if we can just dissolve this at any time for any reason, but we have to pay a bunch of money to do it. Like, well, why not just be together because we want to be together, and when we don't, we just part ways, and then we won't have to pay lawyers a bunch of money
Yeah,
to.
I I mean, I can say just working at child support and reading as many court orders and judgments as I have, there were just two kinds of cases. There were people who had gotten together and they split up, but they weren't married, and that usually just involved child support,
Yeah.
and maybe child care, something like that. And there could be a custody battle, but then there were the people who were actually married and then they got divorced, and it was like child support, spousal support, all the assets and all these kinds of things. And it just the ones where people actually signed the marriage certificate just seemed way more painful and full of a bunch of extra steps for no reason. To where me
Yeah.
as a guy that's just working there, I'm like, yeah, I would probably take the former option if I was going to walk through the fire here. And then if it split up, well, it's a heck of a lot easier. You know what I mean? At least in that way. And
Yeah.
I can understand why people don't like the sound of that, but I think they just need to understand that they have ruined the marriage sort of deal or the marriage contract so badly out here that it's
Mhm.
it's irrational at this point to sign the marriage contract and do it the way that we're doing it today. Unless she
Yeah.
was coming with a sizable dowry or contribution, then maybe I'd sign it.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was telling a friend of mine at work today he's been divorced once and he's going through now a second divorce.
Mhm.
And I was telling him, like, yeah, it just seems like legal marriage, unless you're a rich person who are like you have a bunch of estates and like assets and all this stuff, and then your wife that you're gonna marry, she has like a lot of assets and things that she's bringing.
Mhm.
Then maybe you'd want to have like a legal marriage to form like a legally financial partnership that
Mhm.
there's going to be things. But if you don't have that, why on earth would you sign the legal doc? Because then, if you don't have that much money to begin with, why would you want to spend thousands of dollars to break up the marriage you know, when you have what a almost 60% chance that it's going to break up? Like, what?
Not to
Why would
mention,
people who don't have any money? Why would you even want to worry about it?
yeah,
Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, and it's funny because most people today are signing James Sexton, the family law lawyer. He's gone,
yeah.
you know, uh, kind of mainstream or viral all over the place. But he's mentioned that people are still signing a contract that they don't know the terms to, which is basically the family code in your jurisdiction. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because actual marriage contracts are more like what you just described. Like there's this kind of business arrangement partnership going on, and there's all kinds of stipulations in there. And it's
Yeah.
these contracts, they're not even always just the two people. Some of the stuff, there's this book on inheritance I've been reading, and it's talking about contracts that they'll specifically discuss what assets are coming into the marriage, what's the dowry, maybe the bride's family is giving over this piece of land or something, but then there'll be a stipulation that says, well, the in-law, the bride's mom and dad are going to live here, and this is your obligations, the son-in-law, to them, because you're going to be, you at least have to do this as they get older and go into their old age and stuff like that. And so at least this much from the land needs to be provided for them. There's, I really feel like a stream on just marriage contracts or the history of contracts or the different kinds that we have that have survived from them would be really good. I've been reading this other book, and it talks about, it's called Marriage Transactions in Ancient Palestine, and it's going over, it talks a lot about, the marriages in the Old Testament and the bride wealth and the things you've actually read that are in there. But then just after, that stuff is written, then it's going into these sort of extra biblical things, and it's going through actual marriage contracts we have from back then that are showing what assets the husband, and the wife brought in. And one I'm reading will talk about the husband paying I think the mohar, of 5 shekels, and that's going over that way to her family. But she's actually bringing in 65 shekels worth of things, and this is how you start seeing it transition to a dowry from a bride wealth. So when you compare it to what we're doing today, which is essentially no contract, maybe a minority of people get a prenup, but that's just protecting what you're bringing in,
Yeah, well, and
for
that's
the most
frowned
part.
upon too. We're like, even my friend I was talking to today, he was like, my pastor, if you would mention to him that you were going to do a prenup, he would probably throw you out of his office, like this is just unconscionable, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But even when you were talking about just the marriage contract, though, the thing that's so unfair as well is like if you got married in 1972 and then let's say, 3 years ago you got divorced, the marriage law, like the laws that were in place in 1972, it's not like they hold your marriage to those laws when you sign the contract. Then those laws have completely changed and probably been added
Yeah,
to 400
updated.
times over.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute, I signed a contract and this was the terms of the contract in 72 when we got married. And they're like, no, that doesn't matter. We actually made 400 changes just last year to the
Yep.
same thing.
Yeah,
And
and it doesn't matter when you signed it, well, this is what it is now. I mean, now the calculator has changed, or this is the updates to paternity laws, or whatever it happens to be. I've had to explain to a lot of
yeah,
guys going through a divorce just because they're wondering why we're, as the child support, is doing things that we're doing, and I have to explain to them all these things about how signing this marriage certificate license has affected how paternity is going to be viewed, on them from the state, basically. And it's all things
mm,
people, and I don't even blame them. I get that people aren't going to sit there and know the whole family code. And then it's one thing to read it, and there's reading it is still good, but then it's like, oh, how is this actually applied in the courtroom and things like that? So it just,
yeah, it's just crazy. Like even if you were a lawyer, you probably, unless you study it every single year, you're
yeah.
not even going to know what what the full implications of signing the marriage contract are,
Yeah. Oh, they have
which is
handbooks.
crazy to
Like
me.
they have
Like,
handbooks that are released every year that have, the new updates and things like that. I would see them around the child support agency. Like sometimes there'd be these attorney sort of guidebooks, and you'd see like, oh, like if you found a piece of history lying around in the office, like here's one from 10 years ago, and then there's the brand new one today that they all from this year that they all have. And we'd get
yeah,
emails, like there'd be mass emails like this just changed, or because of the governor's new this Senate bill, or whatever it happened to be, or this is going to be adopted next year, and these are the changes we're going to see in the family law code. So we're going to start doing cases this way. And, it can seem
yeah,
incremental, but as time goes on, those little step by step changes start to fashion different legal landscapes that, you didn't expect before.
And it would be pretty awesome if they made it so it's not retroactive. So they just said, "Oh yeah, listen, these laws don't apply to
Yeah.
you because your marriage contract was in 1987."
Yeah. Some of them, sometimes I would see something like that, but they were usually for like very exceptional things, like I,
Really?
yeah, or just like when like certain things, like when it comes to like paternity laws, like you probably, if it was done way before this became a law, like, or this only applied to certain cases from this time, like before genetic tests existed or something, like there would just be these little
Oh,
quirks, but they weren't like these wide ranging things, at least not that I can remember off the top of my head. For the most part, once it changes, it changes. That's what it's
yeah,
gonna
and that's
be.
why it's just like even I don't know, like if I was going to advise, I've got three sons, so if I was going to advise my sons, it'd just be like, I don't know if I'd sign a contract that even is going to change, you know, 500 times the next 3 years that you have no clue what it even means anyway. Like,
Yeah.
why? I don't know. Why sign that? That doesn't really make sense. But yeah, certainly we're going to go to the church. We're going to covenant before God,
Yeah.
make
Yeah, and
vows.
I
Um,
that would
yeah.
make sense, and I think so long as uh your religious institution's willing to do that, then that would be
Yeah.
like best case scenario, frankly. Um, with the families there and this kind of stuff, but I don't know. The more, it's like the laws are one thing, and then it's the culture that we have. It does seem like this kind of perfect storm that almost makes you think, yeah, it is kind of headed for a collapse, but hopefully
Mhm.
not. We're working hard over here
Yeah.
to thwart
Well,
that.
and in the chapter now he's saying he starts kind of towards the end of chapter one, he starts talking about
Hmm.
gynocentrism. And he says, gynocentrism is a focused on women and concerned only with women, and that we live in a gynocentric chivalric society. And I thought, yeah, I mean, that's fair. That and
Yeah,
he talks about the lifeboats. Hey, listen, it's women and children first. You got to die in the ice, with uh, the guy from Titanic. Shoot, what's his name? Jack. You and Jack, you're getting in the water. Rose has to live on so that she can
exactly.
live her best life now. And, she'll have fond memories of you giving your life for her.
Yeah, all the way up till she's old and finally throws that whatever that was in the water.
The priceless diamond.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing that I appreciated about what he said at the end of the chapters, or at least pointed out, was because he's charting where this all begins, and he's kind of
Mhm.
rooting it here in the 12th century.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he says, with all this in mind, it makes little sense to talk of gynocentric culture starting with the Industrial Revolution a mere 200 years ago, or 100 or even 30 years ago, or of it being 2 million years old, as some would argue. We are
Mm.
not simply fighting 2 million years of genetic programming. Our culturally constructed enemy is much, much similar to pinpoint and to potentially reverse. And I like that because a lot of folks who are kind of ignorant to the history in here is
Yeah.
what they'll say is like, well, evolutionary biology is what dictates, everybody staying back on the ship as it sinks, or at least the men or whatever, and this kind of thing.
Oh,
But
because yeah, eggs are expensive and sperm's cheap. Yeah.
yeah, which is like this. It's just this kind of sort of pseudo, I don't know, scientisms that people come with. But he's pinpointing it and he's saying, no, it was different before that. And then this is where you
Mm.
see this start to come in. It's not
Okay.
this evolutionary biological thing like most people
Yeah.
will try to rest it on. It's actually this specific cultural change that we're seeing here. Um,
Yeah, and that's interesting you say that because it makes me think of like if you read books about the Native American Indian tribes that when the chivalric white settlers came over to the Americas and they observed like the the tribes and how their societies function. I mean, whoa, they worked those women like dogs, and there was no romantic love
yeah,
for
I mean,
any of that.
I'm sure it wasn't just. I mean, like a lot of the other parts of the world, they probably went to.
Mm,
I'm sure they saw that kind of same stuff, or just stuff that was not gynocentric. And
yeah.
when it's interesting too. And then the other thing I think about is just how much it spreads or how it happens. And it seems like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Because you see it starting in one
Mhm.
place, or at least reaching this kind of metastasizing in England, and then just being spread into all these different places. And as you start to
Well, he
see,
mentions a few pages before that how this when this took hold, this was a revolution bigger than any revolution that had come before as
yeah,
far as how it
it,
shaped society. And I thought that was pretty interesting to think about, like how this is much bigger than the pill or the
mhm.
Industrial Revolution or any of that stuff to shape society
Yeah,
with.
those people were like, maybe you can even say kind of like woke, I guess you can say, or like that type of strain where it's this small minority of eccentrics or something that are
Yeah,
doing this, and somehow they're just have these really loud voices that are are in the culture. It just seems that way. And then, when I parallel it to today, and then nowadays you have, it's so down on the other side of I don't know, trying to like undo traditional roles, or even just regular
mhm,
roles at that, or all roles at that, to replace it with some sort of thing of the imagination or whatever it happens to be. And looking back at that
yeah.
time, you can kind of see like, oh, okay, yeah, these were the folks that were kind of doing this back then. And I just keep looking at this as society changes, or as environmental or economic circumstances start to change, and we have to deal with certain realities. Um,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? People have to start.
Well, even,
It's
hey, do you think so? This is interesting. It just popping in my head that I think this is starting to happen in Japan. They're talking about it, and maybe other places, but it seemed like the thing I was watching was in Japan, where couples are starting to have, um, it's like non-romantic marriages of necessity, where it's like I don't know if you've seen this. I forgot the
that
name
sounds
of
very
what
familiar.
they were calling it, but it was like the man, the woman, they get together and they share expenses
Hmm.
and that, but they can even like date other people and what, but they're like forming this
Or it's to
partnership.
get their parents off their back or something.
Well, yeah, it wasn't that, but it was
Yeah.
like they were forming this partnership because they needed like someone else to partner with. And then I think they were leaving the door open to having children too
Yeah.
together, but they may still date other people as their like love interest, but they wanted to form like an actual it's it's almost like a business partnership, but it's like a life partnership, like a marriage should actually be.
Yeah.
But then, like, well, but we're doing this because it's practical and blah blah, and it'll be stable, and it's what like maybe we could bring a child into this, but then we want to like leave the door open for
Yeah.
romantic interests here.
It sounds like they're acknowledging that if we're gonna have, like, we need something that's long term and stable, and we both know we're probably, like, the way at least we are, they're trying to also add room for different, like, romantic engagements for both people to, I don't know, get that itch scratched, I guess, but then also be able to have like a nest at home. What,
Yeah,
they might not be wild about each other or something like that, but okay, if we do have kids, then they can be here. Kind of reminds me of some of the like polyamorous relationships, or like, California is kind of a, California just seems to do a lot of this kind of stuff. Or, I mean, this is where no fault divorce happened, but or
yeah.
started, at least in the US. But I remember when the polyamorous stuff was getting big, and there are even law changes. Like, I don't know if you know this, but in California, you can have more than two legal parents for a child. And
Wow.
it's kind of unlimited. It is up to the court. Now, I remember when that changed, and I remember the attorneys coming downstairs to talk to us. But that, you can have more than two parents, and some of that was to kind of account for these sort of polyamorous relationships, where like, okay, if there is a third person who wants to be in their life, or that's how they sell it, or if the court thinks should be in their life, or has held out as a
Oh,
parent for, if you got this kid growing up in this polyamorous house, and there's mom and there's dad and there's other dad or there's other mom or whatever, and then something happens with that relationship. The court actually does now have the power to be able to say, okay, all three of you guys are parents. Or you can get this third person saying, well, I was in this kid's life and I want to fight for custody time. Nobody,
Wow.
no two
Well,
of us were
do you
actually
think?
legally married, but we all three of us were cohabitating in the house, and the kid used to call me
Oh,
mom or dad or whatever it was. And
well, do you think that'll open the door for like polygamy as far as like a man having multiple wives?
it's interesting because the, it's like the recognized husband and wife status is from signing the marriage like license. Like you can't, two people can't, there can't be another marriage to somebody else to where there's three or something like that. But it seems like that's the next step, because if people are going to do these polyamorous things, and the state
Yeah.
wants to get them into this marriage thing, it's like, could you then possibly have a marriage contract that's like, okay, three people can sign this or four people
Mm.
can sign this, and it comes with certain rights, hopefully duties too. We seem to be doing a tough job on that for one side of the equation, but it's just weird
Yeah.
because it's, again, you see this gradual change, and it's, in that kind of situation, it's not even really an official marriage, but the court really looks at cohabitation. You know what I mean? So it's like, oh, you guys were all living together, we're holding out as parents for this kid. But yeah, that one really surprised me, and I'm just like, wow, there can be like, it doesn't even make sense, right? Because
Yeah.
biologically, if we're gonna get
Yeah.
biological here, it's just two people are the parents. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I just wonder sometimes about the polygamy thing if that's coming sometime. But then then you get a little too traditional with polygamy because
mhm.
that's like, Old Testament, like, nah, we don't want to do that because that's a little
This is what it
uh,
was. It was
too patriarchal.
SB 274. It says the three parent law allows the court to recognize more than two parents of a child under certain circumstances to protect the child's best interest. It's always in the name of the child's best interest. And I know it says three parent
Mm.
law. That's just a quote. It's anything more than two parents, whatever the court sees fit. Um,
Wow.
but yeah, I that's the thing, because I wonder where you're at on this. Because you seem like more of a traditionally religious guy. I mean, you're not
Yeah.
like a typical tradcon or something like that. You seem to be more open to understanding some of the more complexities of this stuff instead of just these kind of maxims we get from their side. But
Mm.
do you think that it's possible to kind of bring back a traditionalism that we once had, or it sounds like from what you said earlier, there'd probably need to be a collapse first, or do you think it's just because of birth control and all these changes, it's not coming back, or maybe only for a small minority? I'm very curious to hear what you'd think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think there's gonna have to be reform to the system that we have just because nobody, or not nobody, but so few are participating in the craziness anymore of at least when we're coming to like legal marriage and that. And then even, it may be like our birth rates keep falling, and part of that might be the wreckage of just the divorce and family courts as well. So at some point, the government's going to have to say, well, hey, we need people to have more kids because, we got to have a population to do
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
So that may force them to do it. Now, I just heard like a couple weeks ago, there was a report out of China that they've started reforming some of their marriage laws because of how bad they were towards men.
I saw
Uh,
some of that. Like if they brought a house into the marriage, it would stay theirs after a
yeah,
divorce instead of the wife
yeah.
getting half of it.
And like they were having, I mean, the women were almost rioting in the streets or something from what
Yeah.
I heard. So I think there's going to be a lot more of that coming. Um, it'll probably come too late. And yeah, I
Yeah.
really believe there's going to be a population collapse that just because of simple math, like you don't really need conspiracy theories. Like if you understand simple math, we have to have a population collapse because like it,
Yeah.
it's, uh, So the implications of that though is what I wonder, like how bad that will affect everything if you have that fewer of people, um, like what that'll mean for society. And like because society needs a certain amount of goods and resources and services. And so if there's fewer people, you might just say, well, that means we'll need fewer goods and fewer services. So it should all just correct itself. But I think it's the transition from
Yeah,
we're used to
it
this,
sounds like
but
intuitively it would make sense, but you know what's interesting, right? Because when you look at old marriage contracts, typically something about the parents, like you would see it where it's like elder care was done by the family, right? Wasn't done by the
yeah,
state. And it's interesting because it's like we still have this problem of elder care, and we do that through like things like Social Security, for
yeah,
instance, or this, the kind of welfare system that we have. And this kind of relies on a population of young people being there working, and so
yeah,
that they can get these things out of their paycheck, and that it would then fund the folks who are older right now and help them out.
yeah.
But the transition period is like you're going to end up with this population skew where you have a lot of older folks and you don't have enough young people who are able to actually collectively provide this collective elder care that they got
Yeah,
to
you won't
do.
have the actual manpower. You could have all the money in
Yeah,
the
that's a good
world,
point.
but you may not have the manpower to actually, do what you want to do unless we go to robots. And I don't know. Like I'm into robotics myself in my career, and I don't see robots doing those kinds of things. Even with all the AI and whatever that we have right now, I still don't
They
see
would need maintenance, or I mean, these have to be some amazing robots where they can just do all this
Yeah.
stuff without humans constantly fixing them. Or I mean, I
Yes,
don't know,
exactly.
like I know there's some sophisticated stuff out there, but even if you look at certain, like I feel like everything just requires maintenance or is bound to fail, and it
Yeah,
still goes
yeah, that's
back to a
true.
human
Yeah.
eventually. So
So that's where I think it could get really bad for again like this transition period from where we have like a large growing population and everybody was used to that to we have this like smaller population that will happen
yeah.
because I mean it's just simple math that will happen and just that transition period I think could get really
Yeah, when I think about traditionalism coming back, I sort of see it as like it would have to get bad, and it would have what comes after that would have to be kind of similar circumstances that would accommodate traditionalism. But if the technologies and different things stay, I do see that there could be some use for maybe some folks who are able to incorporate some aspects of the way things used to be done, whether it's things like the dowry, or if they can't afford Social Security, but you've had some kids, and you can get elder care figured out that way, where you
yeah.
work as a family in a different way, then maybe
I've
those are the
I've
folks that
heard
pull through, and it leads to a society that's more akin to how it was in more traditional times back then. The technology is
yeah
always
that
the X
is
factor for me.
That is kind of the cool thing that like I've got 5 kids and it is kind of neat to think about like there's so much I even personally know I'm in a fairly conservative part of the US. I'm in the Midwest.
Hmm.
I know so many people that are I'm in my 40s that are in their 40s. They have nice careers, they have plenty of money, no kids.
Yeah,
And I'm just like my genes will get to live on.
yeah.
Yours will die out after thousands of years of your ancestors bringing you to this point, fighting, snowstorms, saber-toothed tigers, whatever else. And your line's going to die out because
That's the
I
unfortunate.
didn't feel like having any because they're kind of a nuisance or something like what?
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing, and I mean it's for both men and women on that, on the clock. Unfortunately, and even for myself, all I can say is, well, you can only hope and try your best there. But
Yeah.
it is true, and then when you wonder about old age, like what's old age gonna be like, and you can only try your best to prepare for that. So it's
Well,
gonna
I
be
like to
tough for a lot of
listen.
folks.
I like to listen to it's Malcolm and Simone Collins. They're these pro-natalist
I think
people.
I've seen them. I think I've
Have you
seen them.
seen
They
them?
got
Yeah.
they wear the glasses.
Yeah, yeah. They're kind of eccentric looking.
Yeah.
But they're really good at talking about this. They kind of opened my eyes to some of this stuff of like, yeah, this is just simple math. Like this
Yeah.
isn't conspiracy theories. Um, but they were talking about how just, going through scenarios of what could, when the population starts to collapse, like how bad it could get. And they were saying like, what if like the only people who would get government services are people who actually had kids and contributed to society.
Yeah.
And that would be one of the metrics that they take for if you get provided for in your old age. And I was like, wow, like that just blows my mind. Like
Hmm.
if something like that would happen, that would just be so nuts.
Oh yeah. I mean, it would change if changes like that happened. I think people would be more likely to do family planning. Like we just have a huge absence of family planning going on in exchange for unfettered romantic engagements.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
oftentimes don't even lead to children being made, whether it's birth control or even abortion or things like that. But
Yeah.
if there were these concerns, like if this a robust welfare system wasn't there, a lot of people would have to sit there and think like we have to be smart about how we do this, or you know what
Mhm.
I mean. Even back then, people people with women with no dowries could expect not to marry because it's just like, well, if you're going to do this and have kids, like, are you all just going to starve? I mean, there's only so much the community can do. I'm sure the church can help at some things, but at the end of the day, there are these very real realities here.
Yeah.
So it would, it would mean there's people would want to do some kind of family planning, but people have been so comfortable, and I think the economy's tightening up. Like you say, it's really a numbers situation here, and
Yeah.
as it
Well, I
gets
just wonder too,
tighter,
it may not even, the thing that's crazy to me is what if it's not the money? What if your money just can't buy you the things that you
yeah,
need it to buy you? Like, I even think we're seeing just a little bit, a tip of the iceberg on this with some of the services that used to be easy to get, um, like in skilled trades.
hmm
They can, like, I hear a lot of people talking about how, like, yeah, for my house, I needed tile work done to remodel
or the
something.
roof changed or something.
Or, yeah, and it's like, I can't find somebody to come in and do my tile work.
Yeah,
So it's like, they might be willing to pay a crazy amount of money. There's just nobody within reason to do the work for them. Well,
or
I'm
they
just
want a
like I
lot of
start
money,
hearing,
or they're just super busy, or like they're booked out until two, three
yeah, they're
months
booked
from
out
now.
like 3 years. Like even like I had a new house or new house, new roof put on my house last year. I had to wait a year for the
Wow.
roofers to come out and put it on.
Wow. And then by then
And
a year's time goes by and they're like, well, materials change, so that's the one thing you're subject to in terms of price. Like, I know we gave you this quote a year ago, but
yeah,
shingles
so
cost
I'm
this
I'm
much
just saying like
now.
I think that's just like a tip of the iceberg of like
A
in
shortage of
another
services.
yeah, in
Yeah.
another 20 years it may be yeah, my the plumbing's broke and I can't get a plumber to come out for 3 months and
Yeah.
I just flooded out my house
Oh my
because
gosh.
you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I've never even really thought of it like to like that level, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's just like a lot of folks aren't really cut out to maintain or do these things themselves. And when you look in the past, a lot of people did do a lot of this kind of stuff themselves at least, but the way we live
Yeah.
now and the luxuries that we have and the way that they're made and the kind of specialization that there needs to be to handle all these things.
Yeah. Now
um
that could drive women to want to get married to a more traditional man as well, except there's always some simp they can call to try and sucker them into some. So, it may not be that big a deal.
yeah, the white knights, the simp economy.
Yeah. Well, that was This is Shaw on my channel here talking about Chivalry Chapter 1 and the intro. Good stuff. I hope you enjoyed that. We'll go to Chapter 2. Hopefully next week we can get into Chapter 2. And I want to remind us that we're getting this turned around because Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is Post Millennial Man.